Hello everyone, welcome back to our Through the Bible study. Today we're going to be getting into a very important section of Scripture, of which I'm sure at least a section of which you're all familiar with. If you can turn to Exodus chapter 19, we're going to pick up where we left off in the book of Exodus, where Moses is going to be given the law. Now, this isn't just any law, this is I Am's law, the eternal law, God's law. And especially among internet culture, there are three things that are oftentimes neglected concerning God's purposes, God's will, and God's desires for our lives, and especially that being His heart to be for our help and not for our hurt, that when He says don't do something, He means don't hurt yourself, and especially and most importantly, why we're starting in chapter 19 instead of 20, historical context. Who is He speaking it to? Under what circumstances were these words spoken? And what are their implications now and today? All these are going to be discussed and emphasized with the limited amount of time that we have. We'll be discussing 5 chapters, so let's get into it. Exodus 19, in the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, so it's in around July, considering the fact that the Jewish New Year, Passover, their departure from Egypt was in early April. You add up the numbers, the 7th month. So, on our calendar anyway. On the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. This is where Moses had the vision regarding the burning bush, and that's where they camped, in Rephidim and Sinai. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Very miraculous means. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, my promise, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So God reminds Israel not only the circumstances of which God brought them out of the land of Egypt, but also their promises going forward. Why Israel is referred to as God's chosen people, not because they were anything special or unique, but that their calling and the special blessings that they would have in obedience to God's will and law, and especially regarding a direct relationship with Him, this is what He means by holy, meaning set apart, unique, different. Where all other nations had a fake man to lead them, Israel would have a true and living God. Someone who not only knew the deepest facets of biology and human function in order to actually help Israel survive through things like the Black Plague during the Dark Ages and basically confirm dietary laws that were thousands of years ahead of their time, but even more so and more importantly, understanding the concept that you don't want to touch dead things before the germ theory was even a theory. So all these things being pointed out to them, He said, You'll be a holy nation to me, meaning set apart and unique, different from all the other nations, but also a kingdom of priests. And naturally, in a kingdom, you have a king. You have an absolute ruler, a leader. And I hesitate to say dictator because of the historical annotations we oftentimes give to them, but dictator just means absolute and singular ruler. It was a Roman term, in fact, that applied to a senatorial representative who would be lifted up during times of war to represent the entire nation so that decisions could be made more quickly before peacetime happened again and power would return to the Senate. That's why Caesar was assassinated. He held on to his dictatorship too long and they started to get nervous. So Israel's king would be God. They would be in a sense a deocracy, or a theocracy as the outside world would view them. And they'd actually see that unlike all the other pagan religions, the system actually worked, that there was something to this God of theirs, and possibly getting a chance to give them an opportunity to look into it, and to what made their God, or their gods rather, lesser or unable to help them than the Israelites' true and living God. Now, the kingdom of priests is also interesting because a priest is someone who has a personal relationship with God, an intermediator for a person and God to stand between them, so to speak, and essentially point out or overshadow the one sin so that the other one can have a relationship. It's like essentially playing telephone for two people. I'd say the most direct reference is when you see someone having frustrations in a relationship, so you like are in the same room, but you tell the person, can you tell them that I said such and such, and you see Dwight get this kind of turned on its head in The Office. But all those references aside, the kingdom of priests would mean that everyone in Israel would have the personal opportunity to come before and serve God in a very direct and personal way. But the conditions for this relationship, since Jesus Christ had not come yet, would be under a law and covenant. Do you agree to my commands? Are you willing to follow me? Are you willing to say yes to the things I approve of, say no to the things that disgust me? And most of all, are you willing to pursue a relationship with me where that you trust me when I say don't do something, you obey it? So Moses calls the people of Israel and says, this is what he said. He brought back the words of the people, and they said, yeah, we'll do it. We'll be happy to do it. And well, they hadn't heard what he asked him yet. And that's what we're going to be getting into in the next 4 chapters. The Lord said to Moses, behold, I will come to you in the thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and believe you forever. So God was going to physically manifest himself to the people of Israel, in that Moses told them about this, and also, considering this would be a royal visit, set up some terms and conditions for how things were going to go. We roll out the red carpet. We set up little barricades for the lines and saying you don't cross this line out of respect for that person unless you're being directly invited for like an autograph or a picture or something. And naturally, if it's a royal visit, they would also have military escorts, and if you were to make rash moves or chant any Arabic phrases that would cause concern in crowded places, they would open fire on you. And it was the same principle. If God, being their king, was going to visit, there would naturally be terms and conditions for his visit. So God said, consecrate yourselves, for in 3 days I will come down to you, and I will verbally tell you my law. I will tell you what the covenant is going to be concerning having a relationship with me, leading up to what would ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus Christ, what my standards are for a relationship, so to speak, how my nation is going to be run. He says, don't let anyone touch the mountain. Just basically set up the barriers of the lines around the mountain. Not even an animal is supposed to touch that mountain out of respect for the ground that it's hosting. The feet that are going to be touching that mountain are going to be God's. And we're going to read here in a few verses that it was so consumed by its power that it was literally transforming into a volcano. It was melting, it was quaking, it was just barely able to contain the power of what it was actually getting the privilege of getting to hold up, the very presence of its creator. Don't touch the mountain or the base, and anyone who does shall surely be put to death. Any violation of your relationship with God is separation from him, and separation from life philosophically results in death. So this would be the death penalty. If you see any animal touch that mountain, shoot it with an arrow or stone it to death. And that's really a note on how serious this was going to be considered. And when you hear the trumpet sounds long, they shall come near the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and sanctified the people. They washed their clothes, and he said to the people, be ready for the 3rd day. Do not come near your wives. So 3 conditions. Don't touch the mountain. That's where I'm going to be standing. I want you guys all to stay in the crowd section until I personally call you up. Second is to wash your clothes. You know, they didn't have a lot to access since they were traveling. But naturally, you want to look your best, so wash yourselves physically, prepare yourselves relationally. Just give me the respected space that I asked for. And then most of all, don't come near your wives. Now, this is essentially referring to the sexual relationships of husbands and wives. Take 3 days off. You'll live. But I want you to focus on me, not on pleasing each other, but just focusing on what is going to be established here. You made a promise to each other to love, to cherish, to provide for each other in my name. But now understand my relationship with you is more important, even than that of your spouse. So I want you to recognize that when you come before God, and I'm not saying this as a rule, but this was just in this specific circumstance, the focus needs to be on him. So God said, don't have relationships with your wives or wives with your husbands, because I want the focus to be on your relationship with me and what ultimate blessings you'll get out of interactions on my case. So, on the 3rd day, in the morning, there was thunderings and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain. And the sound of the trumpet, this noise that could only be compared to a trumpet blast, just kept getting louder, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. So the voice of God was imposing, to say the least. And Moses has a little fun with this. He brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. He's the only one standing up, and they're like, I don't want to go on this Disney ride, Daddy. I didn't think it'd be this massive. Well, that's kind of the point. Now, Mount Sinai was completely in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. Its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And when the blast of the trumpet sounded long and became louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by voice. Then the Lord came upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. So this cloud, this pillar of sheer thick smoke is just bursting with thunder and lightning and this huge noise like F-15 class sonic boom levels, just by the sheer majesty of who was going to be stepping on this mountain, are the results of God making footfall and veiling his glory so that the afterglow of him just being there doesn't melt the faces off of all the people, because in all honesty, what would happen if we tried to have a personal conversation face to face at this distance with our planet sun? Now compare that to the one who created it, and you see the issue why God was putting a veil there. Only come up the person that I've told you to. And he says specifically, Moses, come up, I'll give you my law. Now, unfortunately, being 80 years old, climbing up to the top of any mountain is a journey. And the Lord said to Moses, when he finally got up there, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them. Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come to Mount Sinai. You warned us, saying, set bounds around the mountain and consecrate it. And the Lord said to him, away, get down, and then come up, you and Aaron with you, but do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. So essentially, the people, just awe-inspired by this whole scene, are getting kind of starstruck, and you could imagine the mentality of just having to take this all in and saying, what did he tell us to do again? I have no idea. Hey, you want to go look at it? We'll see what's behind this mountain? Sure, and get incinerated. God's really making a demonstration of his character here, that before he gives the law, you see that he's not only to be taken seriously, he gives a full demonstration of his power, but you also see his heart. That before he tells them to do a single thing, he does what? He says, make sure that they understand. Do this and you won't die. I want to spare life. Because the Tumblr-esque version of God would say, oh yeah, of course, God would be just like setting this whole dramatic scene up so that people would want to walk in and get incinerated. Of course, God would set up a mousetrap, say don't touch it, knowing that our curiosity would get the best of us. The first thing that God says is, Moses, remind them, I don't want anyone to die. This is a time where I'm going to be giving life. This is a time where I'm going to remind you what life is all about. And so the law begins with a second opportunity, a reminder, because we as human beings, nothing can be further from the truth. The thing we understand the clearest is the thing we have to hear more than once. So, God points this out as not only a very serious situation, but a very strictly presented one as well. Now, we get into chapter 20, which I'm sure most of you guys are at least familiar with by concept. If you're any Charlton Heston fans or DreamWorks Pictures animation films, you'd remember these. God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, that is in earth beneath, that is in the water, under the earth. Now ready? You shall not bow down to them or serve them. That's the second commandment. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations, to those who hate me. But, verse 6, showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Now, emphasis on that term jealous. It means the same jealousy that a husband would have to his wife, an exclusive desire in their relationship to not want to share. And the important thing to consider in that note is that God isn't interested in sharing your heart, your soul, your affection with anything else, not because he's such a stick in the mud, but because he knows no one can satisfy you like he can, and he doesn't want to see you disappointed, hurt, or confused and end up blaming him for something that you did on your own. He's willing to provide you fair warning. But with this second commandment here, understand the commandment is you shall not make anything to bow down to it. Is all art evil? No, but if any object becomes more important in your life than God, that's a problem. Because why? It won't satisfy. God will. And that's the point. If you put your eternal hope in your car or your hobby or your relationships, they can't help you when you're dying. And God doesn't want you to set yourself up for disappointment. There's a reason for these commands. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. This is referring to blasphemy. If you take the name that is above all names, the voice of the title, the identity of the one who's consuming this mountain and literally turning it into a volcano when it was just a pile of rock earlier. Israel was understanding how serious this was. And that's the most important thing to remember, is that when we use these things as a slander or term of vulgarity and just say, oh, it doesn't mean anything, I'm just saying words to fill in synonyms, to keep my tongue loose. Understand, God takes it personally when you take the name that gave up everything so that he could have you, that created the universe and all that is in it and treated it as a common thing. He takes that thing very seriously. And if you aren't willing to consider his feelings, then how could you hope to be able to consider the feelings of anyone else? You put God first and his respect first, it will come out in your life as well. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall do labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work. Oh, how oppressive. God wants you to take a day off. No, not your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant. No chores on Saturdays, kids. Nor your cattle, nor your stranger, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days, note the example they're following, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So these first 4 commandments regarding our relationship with God, it's just simply summarized in this. If you love God enough that you are going to respect him in his name, respect him and follow his examples, and trust him enough to satisfy in the way that he promises, you're not going to be making alternatives. You're not going to be settling for less than him, and you're not going to be disrespecting him when his name comes up in conversation. So all of these things being noted in summary, coming from the mouth of Jesus himself in Matthew 22:37, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, soul, and strength. That's the commandment with promise. But then, putting our relationship with God first in the first 4, now we get to our relationship with our fellow men. Specifically, the first 2 that we interacted with. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Now note, this does not base itself on the terms and conditions as to whether or not your mother and father are honorable. If you honor them as you honor God, God says he will bless you. This is the first commandment that actually includes a blessing with it. You'll have long and prosperous life, even if they tend to be jerks. Because note, they're human just like you. But God's saying, you honor them, you honor those that represent me in your life, that even when they make mistakes, you still trust and honor them, you still give them their due respect as your parents and obey them. That's going to reflect in your relationship with me and with others as well. It's an important point to note. You shall not murder. Very straightforward. And note, it doesn't say thou shalt not kill. Violence isn't a crime. Violence is amoral. It could be used to stop a crime as much as start one. It depends on the heart of the individual doing it. And if someone's going to take a life based off of emotional motivation, instead of out of the desire to seek justice, Batman wouldn't kill anyone anyway, so... Point and illustration being made. You shall not commit adultery. Again, very straightforward. You're not going to violate the promises you made to your spouse. You're not going to violate the promises that you made to God. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't lie, especially in a court of law. And the 10th, you shall not covet. Note that word covet means a desire for something that you don't have, a longing for someone else's possession. And it emphasizes your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, his servant, female servant, ox, donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Isn't that interesting? The first 5 commandments, referring to your relationship with other people, are outward actions, how you respond to them, how you interact with them, how you treat your marital relationships or your relationships in regards to other people. But then what does it say? An attitude. Not to desire the things that don't belong to you, to trust God to have given you all that you need. Isn't that interesting? Now, taking time to emphasize these points being the important passage of Scripture that it is, I want to point out to you an extended Old Testament minor prophet who would commentate on these very verses to provide a little insight into the point as to why they were given. Commentary on Jesus as to which ones are most important, and of course an extended commentary from the Apostle Paul in the book of Galatians, where he emphasizes, based off of the example of the life of Christ, what was the whole point of giving us this law in the first place. Again, the extended literary context, letting the Scripture interpret Scripture. So, Micah 6 and verse 8 is the first I want to turn you to. This is an Old Testament minor prophet, probably easier for those who are using technology to look up these verses, but I want to encourage you, if you have a physical copy, find it. This is important. He has shown you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. This is referring to how a man would make himself right with God. What do I have to do? Do I offer all these cows? Do I offer rivers of oil? Do you want my kid? What do you want, God? And God said, I've already told you. I've already shown you what is good. Be fair, love forgiveness, and most of all, just trust me. Know that I am going to lead you in the right path. And if you understand this, you understand God's heart. He's not here to tell you don't do this and don't do that. He's here to say, I want to show you a better way. I want to make you into a better person. And if these are your start, He will be your finish. And that's the whole point. Quoting Jesus regarding this first and great commandment, regarding the verse that we quoted earlier, I'll read the next 2 verses, Matthew 22:38 through 40. Regarding you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, soul, and strength. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law, first 5 books of the Bible, and the prophets, the rest of the Old Testament. Now note, the Gospels and the epistles were being written as Jesus' life was unfolding. So that was the only Bible they had at the time. How do you obey the entirety of the Bible that Jesus grew up with? Simply this: love God and love people. Galatians 5 verse 14, for all the law is fulfilled in one word, even this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And that's it. Love is God's law. And if you are willing to obey this, understand you are perfect. But we aren't perfect. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that. And therefore, if anyone obeys the law in its entirety but violates in one point, he is a lawbreaker. And by that logic, then, we're either all awaiting execution as criminals in God's kingdom, considering all of these, violation of them was death. Either that is the case, or what? We're supposed to try to enter heaven on another basis than these. Consider that. Actually, we have to consider it. Let's read a passage in Galatians chapter 3, verse 24. Keep the context. Therefore, the law was our tutor to bring us to Christ, that we might be justified by works? Obedience? No, faith. Galatians 3:24. If our law is called a tutor, I don't know how many of you guys were smart, but I was not one of you. I needed help regarding my math and English and history and science and Spanish and all these other lessons. I was a very helpless child regarding education, and I needed someone that was known as a tutor to take up the small sections of my childhood life that I could have been dedicating to Pokemon and instead focus on my education. I know, how foolish was I? But the interesting thing was a tutor performed a very specific and unique role in my life. They personally pointed out to me how to solve and overcome the problems I was having in a way that personally and directly applied to me. So if I read the Ten Commandments and say, okay, I get this, but what's the deal with this? I mean, I'm having trouble with that one. You shall not commit adultery. Well, I'm not married, and obviously I haven't gone with anyone yet, but I mean, I struggle with my eyes, I'm a dude. I look at girls. I'm attracted. That's the issue. And Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6, 5 and 6, he said, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery. So what's the deal? And Jesus says, bingo. The tutor's fulfilled its job. It's shown your need for saving. Because guess what? Violate the law in one place, you're dying. You are considered under death penalty according to God's law and kingdom. And I'm not just referring to Israel, but I'm referring to just in eternity concerning your relationship with Him. So then if I say, okay, so my struggle is with lust, or it is with anger, I call people morons and passively, and Jesus said that's murder in your heart. If I've lied, big if, when I lie, I violated God's law, and I need to understand, so either someone bails me out or I'm toast, and Jesus goes, you got it. That's where I come in. We're justified not by law but by faith, because the law was a tutor to point us to Christ. That being the point made, we see this demonstration and whole doctrine pointed out to us regarding our relationship with God as something to take very seriously. And the people of Israel understood this as well, because they were hearing this with a voice so loud their ears were bleeding. And all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Rightly so. Then they said to Moses, you speak with us, and we will hear. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. So Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that you may fear, that his fear may be before you, so that you may not sin. So the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. Now understand, this is why God doesn't personally deliver every sermon he's ever wanted to say ever. He uses human instruments. Why? Because if he did, we wouldn't hear anything anymore. God doesn't communicate through the dramatic CGI Michael Bay explosions. He communicates one-on-one with using people like pastors and teachers to communicate things at a more personal level. He speaks to you through your conscience, through the filling of his Holy Spirit and the guide of his Word. And noting these methods aren't in a sense a distance from God to make him more ethereal and separate from us, but rather it's for our sakes, because he's just that awesome. We couldn't handle it if he interacted with us actively and audibly every single time. Because trust me, when Israel was receiving this law, it got their full attention. And that's why even when someone, we'll read about this in the book of Numbers, violated the Sabbath on a Saturday, he deliberately, knowing better, gathered sticks on the Sabbath day when he knew he wasn't supposed to, and God said, you have to execute him. Why? Because that person was able to stand before and go, I got my own ideas. I want to be warm my own way. I don't care, God, that you make the camp literally with its own supernatural AC unit where it's warm at night and cool and shaded during the day. I want to be more warm. And that's not something that you want to take lightly in even the smallest regard, because when God executed that man, note, he would have full responsibility to account for his disobedience. But that being an example for the people was also in the cases where someone would curse their father and mother, and regarding the fact that as well it wasn't even an Israelite who did this, it was an Egyptian hanging-on kid. But he had agreed to this promise, and he was there when he violated this command of God, and he would have to answer to God for it. He separated his relationship with God, and the result, i.e., therefore, was death. All these things are being taken so seriously because it's literally to give us no other option but to plead for mercy before God, because we couldn't relate to him any other way. My youth pastor and personal mentor in the faith is actually famously quoted as saying, if we don't serve a God of mercy, we're toast. And that's the good news, because he is. But noting these things as well, we get into the topic of worship and how sacrifices would be made during those times. That's how they would recognize what God was going to do. That's what worship means, recognizing what someone has done. Praise is recognizing what they've done. Worship is recognizing who someone is. And if Israel was going to worship, recognize God for his kingship, his rulership over their lives, they would offer animal sacrifices to ultimately point to the ultimate act of worship where God would provide himself a sacrifice. Hashtag Genesis 22. But in Exodus 20:22, ironically enough, God lays down, before getting into any other details, this is the extended entirety of the law, the laws for altars. He says, when you offer anything, don't offer them to idols of silver, gold, wood, anything that you make. And most importantly, when you offer a sacrifice to me, do it on natural stone. Don't, work your chisel and try and make a fancy altar for me. I want something natural. Why? Because worship should be considered the same way. And no, worship isn't just singing. It's living life recognizing God's presence. And if I do this in a way where I consider him when I feel tempted to sin, when I consider him when I want to do something good, and I do it for his sake instead of my own, that's worship. But when Israel is going to offer these animals as a prescribed method of worship that would one day be ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ, talk about this more in Hebrews, he says, here's the conditions. Don't show off how you worship. Just do what you know you're supposed to do. This rock was made by me. I've given you the opportunity to worship me. I've done these wonderful things in your life that you recognize who I am. If you try and add yourself into it, it's like Chuck Smith used the illustration equivalent of, I love drinking water. It's very refreshing. It's important. It keeps me alive. I love the taste of onions, mix it in with soups, and it's great. I don't like those things together, though. When I drink water and it tastes like onions, not that I hate onions, but those two things don't belong together. There's a time and a place for demonstrating artistic talent and the gifts that God's given you, but when you worship God, make sure it's natural, not to show off. That's why Jesus himself said in Matthew 5 and 6, that when you pray, don't make a public spectacle of yourself. Go into your room, lock the door, close the closet. Not to say that prayer always has to be the secret affair, but it shouldn't be to be seen by men. It should be to talk to me. 2 ears, one mouth, use accordingly. That's the point. So, now we get into something very useful, especially for the internet subculture. Chapter 21 of Exodus. This is the laws of Israel concerning slavery. And I want to read these verbatim to you so you can't take them out of context. Now these are all the judgments which you shall set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, note it acknowledges this, but understand what servants were for in those days. To pay off debts. A Hebrew servant, now this is implying that they're male, he shall serve 6 years, and the 7th he shall go free and pay nothing. So, what does God do about the topic of slavery? Well, he addresses it in the context of being purchased and especially being of Israel. Now, why would an Israel be auctioned up for slavery? Because they had a slave trade? No, these were not foreign slaves. These were Hebrew slaves. So why would a Hebrew be put up for sale? Because he owed a debt he couldn't pay. And in Israeli culture, they didn't have welfare. They would have the opportunity to pay it off by getting a job. Imagine. And instead of government work, you would have social labor. You would essentially become someone's hired hand, a butler or a maid, and you would work off the debt that you owed to this person for no more than 6 years. The 7th year, everyone was to be set free. This would be called the year of Jubilee. If he comes in by himself, it's just him, he shall go out by himself. He'll return to the world with the same relationships that he entered them in. Now, if he comes in, recognize this. This probably wasn't considered by most who heard the word slavery and said, oh, taskmasters, Egyptians whipping. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, you could get married to the person that you are a slave to's daughter? Yeah, that's actually pretty common. Was when you spend 6 years with somebody, you get to know them, you learn to trust them, and in fact, even sometimes, they got married and had kids. But here's the thing. If the servant has kids, gets married, he shall go out by himself. He'll leave behind the life of a slave. But God set a condition. If the servant plainly says, this is open in a court of law, I love my master, my wife, and my children. I will not go out free. Then his master shall bring him to the judges, to the ruling political authorities, and he shall also bring him to the door, or to the doorpost of his home, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl. He'll give him a little gold earring, and he shall serve him forever. Now, that's what that meant when you had a gold earring. You were a bond slave, a slave by choice. And that was the only way to be a slave for your lifetime, is if you chose to do so. Very oppressive. Now, verse 7, this is the one that I really need you guys to hear. If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, recognize this, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. There's a difference in how you treat a male slave and a female slave. What is that? If she does not please her master who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. Now understand, there's a lot of people who make jumps in thinking that, oh, if you sell your daughter, you're essentially making her a prostitute. And just like the Muslims in the Middle East and ISIS members and Al-Qaeda and all that, oh, then of course you're just handing women off as property. God views me as an object. I could never trust a God like that. Time out. God said, when you sell, or if you sell your daughter as a female slave, what is to be done immediately? Betroth her to yourself. Now, for those of you who remember the circumstances when Jesus was born, Mary was betrothed to her husband Joseph. They were probably arranged to be married very early on in their lives by their parents. And based off of the circumstances of their betrothal, now that they had become of age, around both the ages of 13 or 14 or so, when puberty started kicking in, you'd have that system put in place. It was actually kind of smart. You would take a year where you would not touch each other. No consummation of the marriage. You would be considered for all intents and purposes married, but you'd focus on dates specifically to get to know each other before the marriage would happen at the end of the betrothal period. Now, you would automatically be betrothed. And this is why when Mary became pregnant, when she was betrothed to Joseph, that he figured, oh, she's committed adultery. Why? Because they were already legally considered married. That's why Joseph, being a just man, he loved Mary. He didn't want to see her killed. He just felt betrayed by what he assumed she did and didn't believe her until the angel himself came and told Joseph, yeah, she's telling the truth. Oh. Otherwise, she would have been stoned to death. Now, consider this as a fact. When you sell your daughter, what? She is to be considered married. But if during that year something comes up, you change your mind, what happens? You let her go free. I don't see any other words there that would say otherwise. Now, ready? He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed her to his son, then he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters, meaning that you would pay a dowry, which would essentially be alimony in advance, and allow her to come back to her family. If he takes another wife, now note, this isn't justifying it, it's acknowledging it as a practice. If this happens, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. You are to marry this girl, or you to set her free. No exceptions. You're not to use her for your body, and if you divorce her, you're going to have to pay for her. Because God cares about these people. God values his daughters. But also recognize this. If you marry another wife and you don't treat her equally, then guess what? If he does not do these three for her, food, clothing, marriage rights, then she shall go free without paying money. Period. How oppressive. Laws concerning violence. The emphasis is all about justice. If you strike a man and they die, you are to be killed. Capital punishment. Life for a life. Now, if he did not lie in wait, it's not premeditated, but God delivered him into his hand. It was an accident. It just was circumstance. Then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. These were known as the cities of refuge. There were 6 available, all within walking and running distance in this case, to everywhere in Israel when it was established as a nation. All of these things being pointed out to us. In the case of manslaughter, you would be given the right to a fair trial if you weren't caught by the police right away. But when, and this is verse 14, but if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. You'd be given a fair trial, but just because you made it to the city of refuge doesn't mean you get away with murder. They'd look at the circumstances, you'd be given the chance to hear your side of the story, but if it was true that it was premeditated murder, you're to be killed. That's it. Fair. He who strikes his father or mother shall surely be put to death. I don't see anything wrong with that. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. He who curses, this probably why, if he who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. Man, I'm glad we're under grace and not the law. If men contend with each other, and one strikes another with a stone or with his fist, but he does not die, but is confined to his bed, if he rises again, if he recovers, then he's not to be punished. But he has to pay the man compensation for his lost time and for his medical expenses, what cost it would be to thoroughly heal him. If a man beats his male or female servant with a rod, now note, so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. But here's the thing. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. Now consider that when a person is a slave, recognize they also used male pronouns on purpose here, because if you beat your wife, that's a cause for punishment. But also considering the fact that this is under the terms and conditions of being a slave. You are considered human property. And if someone abuses you and kills you, you've committed a crime. But if someone abuses you because you're not doing your job, you earned it. Because guess what? You put yourself in this situation and circumstance where you've made yourself less than human. And then you would be redeemed, restored value at the end of your service or at the end of a 6-year period. That's the important thing to recognize when Jesus said that you are slaves under sin. You're objects to him. But if you come slaves of me, I'm a good master. I'm not a slaver. I'm a shepherd, and I treat you as sheep. I lead you to places where you are provided for, where you are safe. I take care of you. But an abusive master is not someone you want to be with, because he can do whatever he wants to you. If he's a good master, he's naturally not going to do these things. But the Bible says if you are put in the hands of someone as their slave, they can do what they want to you. And you need to understand, being a slave is not a place you want to be, unless it's with a good master. Now recognize that as an illustration for future passages. If men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows. Now ready? He shall be surely punished according to the woman's husband, what he imposes on them. So if you hurt a man's wife, and if she's pregnant, nonetheless, he decides what happens to you. I wonder what that will be. He shall pay as the judges determine, but if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life. If the baby dies, if the wife dies, if the man is killed, he's to be judged as a murderer. Burn for burn, or eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. That's the whole point. Justice. Equality. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. If there's any cosmetic, permanent, or long-term damage, they are set free because you were not a good master. If you destroy their eye and they lose it, he's free. If you knock out the tooth, go free. Recognize that. This is not meaning that masters are supposed to be abusive towards their slaves. It means if you strike them and they lose anything, they're no longer your slave because you've shown that you aren't a worthy master to serve. Now, animal control. This is interesting. The verses basically summarize in point. If an ox or an animal that has the potential to do harm, if they just go crazy and kill somebody, then if it was an accident, if this was just freak, I never knew this was even in the mind of the animal, let alone what they were capable of. He was the calmest thing ever until today. Must have freaked out by a snake or something. It was an accident. Then what's to happen is the animal is put to death, and the man is supposed to pay for the damages because it was the animal's fault. The animal will pay the penalty. But here's the thing. If the animal is known to thrash about, if you knew better, you had means to stop it, and someone gets hurt or killed, then you're to be killed because the animal was your responsibility and you did not take protective means. There's actually a case in California a few years ago where these two rescued Malamutes, very large, like bearish type Siberian Huskies, were rescued from a dog pit fight. These arenas where they would train dogs to just tear each other to pieces, fight to the death. They rescued these dogs, good thing. But the problem was one day they were taking these Malamutes for a walk, and this woman was walking across the street, and she was going through her cycles, and when the dogs smelt the blood, they freaked out and they mauled her to death. And the court case ruled a charge of first-degree murder. Now the couple, the person walking the dogs, didn't go, "Oh, there she is, sick 'em!" No, the dogs acted, but the problem was they knew that these animals were aggressive, they were dangerous, they were rehabilitating fight animals. And because they hadn't taken them on a walk with a muzzle or with a secured chain leash or any means to keep this from happening, they were held responsible. That's where this law and principle came from. Now, chapter 22 goes into laws of property and stealing, and as well, a very important one, which we'll get into in a second. Regarding stealing, if you steal anything and you're caught by the person, like in the act, you have the right to kill the person in defense of your property. This is house defense. If you see someone breaking in, you have the right to pull out your gun and shoot them. They didn't have guns back then, but you understand the concept. If they get away and the government catches them, then they are required by law to not only restore to you what they stole, but 5 times as much to repay the insult. You would steal an ox, you'd give 4 oxen back. It's that kind of deal. Now, considering this also for the fact that regarding stealing, the laws of restoration, if it's just an accident, if someone borrows something and they can't return it, the passages that go on to describe this saying, if you can prove that it was yours, if you could provide evidence or witnesses that it didn't look like that before and it was under the care of the servant, then the people who are in charge will be required by law to restore to you not just what you lost, but the best of what they lost, regarding accidents for a vineyard or regardless for a chariot or whatever the case. If you could prove that it was yours and that it was in good condition, normally the person would just, yes, I messed up and I want to restore to you what I lost. If he has to take it before court, that was the rule. Now we get into a very important issue that once again is very prevalent in understanding the context culturally before you start taking words and not knowing what they mean. Verse 16 of Exodus 22. If a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. So, what happens if someone has sexual relationships outside of marriage? If someone who is not married and they do the deed, what happens? Well, including cases for rape, if they lie with them, you have to pay the bride price for her to be his wife. Note, it doesn't say you have to marry her. If someone commits sexual acts upon another person, if you act like you're married, you will be treated as if you're married. And before getting married, they would pay in those ancient days what is called a dowry. Now, a dowry was, as we mentioned before, alimony in advance. You would essentially pay what was the accustomed or accumulated life support of this woman in the case that if you divorced her, she would go back to her father and be able to live the rest of her life off of what you paid in that dowry. It would be a very expensive and hefty value. Now, does this mean that women are exchanged as property? No, that was the Babylonian interpretation of this. But what Israel did was what? You are to show me what you think my daughter is worth, i.e. engagement ring. Instead of a diamond, you would say, okay, I'll put this money forward and say, your daughter is worth that much to me. This proves to you how earnest I am in my claim. And if I divorce her, then I lose this money, just like I lose her affection. And it really proves sincerity in the marriage. Just like the bigger the diamond, the better you can trust the promise. With this point being made, verse 17, if the father utterly refuses to give her to him, so note, dad decides whether or not they get married. He still has to pay for what he did. That's still true. But what then? He shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. But if dad says no, you're not married. And understand, you don't have to marry a scumbag, because I am certain that your daddy is going to care enough about you to say, no, I don't want this man to be near my daughter. And if your dad is an aloof oaf, he doesn't care anything about you, I seriously doubt that under this legal system he'll be around much longer anyway. At that point being made. This is not saying that, in the Bible it says if you rape a girl, then she marries you, and that's horrible and oppressive. No, it's saying if you have any sexual relationship outside of marriage, rape or not, you have to answer to the father what happens to you, the dude or the gal, and then guess what? You have to pay for their entire life's expenses, whether you marry them or not. Slam dunk. Now, you shall not permit a sorceress to live. Sorcery, the Greek word pharmakia, drug abusers, people who look to seances and demonic arts and rituals. This was common in that culture and in that day, and anyone who would introduce these kinds of things into the culture would not only introduce a lot of stupidity into the bloodstream, but as well the exposure to these kinds of things is not what God would want for his people. So anyone who practices drug abuse, who has religious ceremonies and rites that involve the use of narcotics and introducing all of these weird concepts like sucking in sulfuric volcanic ash to poison yourself so you go into these delusions to speak visions of the gods like the oracles at Delphi, or smoking weed to get a sight and revelation from your seance and that kind of deal. These people are not to have any place among the people of God, within or without. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. The best example of this is AIDS and HIV. Do you know how that strain of disease, that human immunodeficiency virus, actually got going? It was when a man and a monkey. God doesn't want these types of diseases formulating, and especially not these kinds of practices, to be acceptable in any way among his people. It's disgusting. If he who sacrifices to any god except the Lord only shall be utterly destroyed. That's the point. No gods before me. Emphasis on that verse, what it looked like in that day and age. Now, verses 22 through 31, just in summary for time's sake. The poor, the widow, people who are less fortunate than you, those are God's people, and those are God's priority. If you don't take care of them, if you are the one who leaves them abandoned or destitute, if you have any role or cause in their situation, or you don't provide or help for them, then guess what? You are to be considered God's enemy. That God is not going to appreciate it if you make things worse for them. So, all this being pointed out for chapter 23, the repeated point of justice is the foundation of God's society. Strangers, foreigners generally weren't welcome because you weren't knowing whether or not they'd introduce these kinds of deals. So Israelites were just like, okay, well, xenophobia then, that's the way to go. No, don't build walls, but understand that you should have a moral code and legal standard. If you come into our country, you obey the country's laws. That's not a lot to demand. But understand that you are to consider them innocent until proven guilty. That's verses 1 through 9. Verses 10 through 13, regarding the Sabbaths, covers the year of Jubilee, 6 years, 1 year. You're going to let it rest. We'll talk about more of this when we get into Jeremiah and the Babylonian captivity, how they didn't follow this and were punished. 6 days, work, but leave it alone and let the land recultivate itself, taking care of the environment, and don't let any other mention of any other foreign gods or concepts be welcome to you, verse 13 says. Verses 14 through 19, it says essentially that all of these things, all of the three festivals and holidays, you're to celebrate the spring, the harvest time, that's at Passover, to celebrate the harvest during summertime, more or less, and you're also to celebrate right before winter when you ingather. You're to give me thanks for all that I've provided for you. There would be more when we'll discuss in Leviticus 23. Unleavened bread, all of those things basically being reiterated and emphasized. If you want to know more, for time's sake I won't, but if you want to discuss them, we have a whole study done on the Passover itself. And verse 19, you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Very straightforward. Trust me, the pagans have done a lot weirder things in dedicating festivals and ceremonies. When they would build a new home, they'd take a newborn infant skull and smash it under a brick so that they could get the favor of the god Molech. It was twisted. Verses 20 through 30 onward, or 20 through 33 rather, the angel of the Lord is mentioned. This is again a theophany, a pre-incarnate manifestation of Jesus who will provide them shade in the manifestation of a cloud during day, not just shade like a cloud that they followed randomly in the wilderness, but this constant fog of God's presence surrounded by a pillar in which God himself would manifest himself to man, and in which one day Jesus would also manifest himself in human flesh to be seen. But also this, he would keep them safe, he would keep them strong, and he would be the one to show them where they were going to go. When they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, that was because they kept doubting God. God led them where their hearts were at. Israel, in chapter 24, essentially just signs in the dotted line, and all of these things are affirmed by them, saying, we swear to this giant display of God's majesty and glory that we will do this exactly as you have said it. To make a long story short, they didn't. We'll talk about this in the future studies, but to review what we've talked about, we've discussed God's law, we've discussed God's heart, we've discussed the context in which they were given. Understand, if you're going to take anything away from this, just know that God loves you, that he wants the best for you. And when he says don't do something, he means don't hurt yourself. He hasn't asked anything unreasonable as far as how his nation's supposed to be run, nor does he ask any more from your life, if you're willing to trust him with it. Thank you for your time listening to this study. I hope it's been a blessing to you. If you have any questions, I welcome them. Leave them below if they're sincere. If you want to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But most importantly, if you know someone who perhaps hasn't heard the law in its context, please share this with anyone you feel would not only be blessed by it, but even informed. Thank you for your time listening to this study, and once again, just remember, Jesus loves you.